Hello, thank you everybody for being here. Welcome to our 33rd annual Robert Salomon Morton lecture. This is a keynote lecture and the keynote event of our annual Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce Dean Tsai to say a few words about this program and its history. But I'm really delighted that we have Professor Peter Hayes here to talk to us. And before I hand over the microphone to Dean Tsai, after which she's going to give it back to me, so for me to introduce the speaker, I just want to say a couple of words, since we have so many students here, which is really wonderful, a couple of words about further events and opportunities. First of all, on Friday at 1:45 in this exact room, we have our annual Survivor Lecture, and we have Suzanne Resnick, who is coming, who survived the Holocaust in France and was a witness to the mass deportation of French Jews, including her father, and survived the Holocaust in hiding, and should really be a very, very meaningful talk, and that's here today, Friday at 1:45, and there will be food as well. And I also want to talk, since I have this captive audience, especially of many students, to mention the opportunities we have for undergraduates in Holocaust studies and Jewish studies. So we have an annual scholarship for supervised research on the Holocaust called the Gideon Klein Holocaust Legacy Foundation Scholarship, which pays an undergraduate student by competition, the winner of the annual competition, $5,000 to pursue research in their chosen field in the Holocaust. And I'm very excited to see that we have both our this year's Gideon Klein Holocaust Legacy Fellow, Melina Coy, in the room, who gave her presentation on Monday, as well as last year's Gideon Klein Holocaust Legacy Foundation scholar, Max Berger, who gave his presentation about a year ago. These are wonderful works. Maybe you probably all read about it in Northeastern Global News this morning, and we all read the Northeastern Global News. Wonderful opportunities, and we have sort of expanded the mandate for this to cover all fields. So if you are thinking of a project and you're interested and you don't know what to do, come speak to me or Professor Borman or Professor Lefkowitz, and we can help you with that. And the other opportunity I just want to mention is for Jewish Studies minors, that you can also talk to Professor Lefkowitz or myself about. And we have an annual competition for the top Jewish Studies minor of the year. There's also a $5,000 scholarship, no strings attached. So that's another incentive to take Jewish Studies classes and join the minor. No, we're not bribing you, but we have this very nice scholarship. Yes. And without further ado, I just want to introduce Dean Kelly Tsai, Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, to say a word about our program.
Great, thank you, Professor Rabinovich. Welcome everyone, and welcome everyone online. I think there may be even more people online than are in this packed room. Just to give you a little bit of background about how this lecture came to be a very valuable tradition here at Northeastern, a group of students, faculty, and staff formed the Holocaust Awareness Committee in the 1970s. This was very early for such a committee at a university level. And in 1977, this committee organized the first of what would become the annual Holocaust Awareness Week and was later renamed the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. Thanks to the generosity of the Geeson and Morton families, the Robert Salomon Morton Lecture has been the keynote, the crown of our week's programming here since 1995. The Morton Lecture was created by Bill Geeson, who was a Northeastern professor of chemistry and chemical engineering, and in honor of his close friend, Robert Morton. Morton was born in an Orthodox Jewish family in Frankfurt am Main in 1906, and in the face of anti-Semitic persecution, managed to flee Germany for Boston in 1937. Geeson was born in the United States in 1932, and his family moved to Germany shortly thereafter. So he grew up there during and after World War II, and attended the University of Göttingen. Gieson then moved to the United States to do graduate work at MIT, and it was at a chance encounter at a barbershop in Cambridge that Morton and Gieson met for the first time, and that led them to become lifelong friends, despite the significant age difference. Faculty fondly recall Bill Gieson and his wife Mary's devotion to Holocaust, fostering Holocaust awareness, and what Professor Bill Miles calls Gieson's, quote, impish humor, infectious laugh, and supreme sense of collegiality. Both the Gieson and Morton families have continued to generously support the Morton Lecture in honor of these two people's remarkable friendship. We are particularly grateful to Robert Morton's son, the late Mike Morton, and Mike's wife, Danny Kapsis, who have ensured the long-term posterity of this lecture series. Danny was not able to make it tonight, but she's online, yes. Thank you. But we really appreciate her support, and we're very delighted to have here Mike's brother, Evan, and his wife, Becky, and their son, Mark, who is a 2022 Northwestern graduate. And I will hand this back to Professor Rabinovich to introduce our esteemed speaker.
Thank you so much, Dean Tsai, for that information about our really important program that we have been, but that we have been so fortunate to maintain. Well, I seem to have put down my note card, but that's okay. I actually know it by heart anyway. For a little note, a lot of work for a little note card. In any event, what I did want to say is that ordinarily I am accused of favoring speakers from Toronto and Montreal, but this time our speaker is homegrown. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Hayes, a child of Alston Brighton who was born just across the fens. Professor Hayes is Professor Emeritus at Northwestern University. I almost made the cardinal sin. Professor Hayes, when he taught at Northwestern, was the Theodore Zev Weiss Holocaust Education Foundation Professor of Holocaust Studies. As befitting a long title, befitting a great scholar. Professor Hayes is the author of many books, 14 exactly, as well as 3 amici curiae briefs to the Supreme Court. His many books include Industry and Ideology, I.G. Farben in the Nazi Era, Lessons and Legacies, Meaning of the Holocaust in a Changing World, and Why, Explaining the Holocaust. Sorry, I need my glasses. Explaining the Holocaust Explaining the Holocaust, right? Yeah. I have them here, but my vanity prevented me from putting them on. He is here today to talk about his latest book, Profits and Persecution, German Big Business in the Nazi Economy and the Holocaust. And I'm delighted also to announce that if you put your name at the front, we have 2 copies that we're going to give away. Caitlin McPhee is going to draw from those signed in, and the lucky recipients will get a copy of the book on their way out. And so now, just before I pass it over, finally, I just want to say my thank yous to Dean Tsai, to the College of Social Sciences and Humanities for your constant support of our programming, to the members of the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee who all put in a lot of time and effort into putting this programming together, to the Morton and Kapsis family for your continued support and your presence, which is much appreciated, to my colleague Lori Lefkowitz, the Ruderman Professor of Jewish Studies, and to Caitlin McPhee as well, wherever she is, for all there she is for all of her work in making things run. So with that, Professor Hayes, would you prefer this microphone or this one? This one. And at the end, we'll have time for a question and answer, which I'll moderate.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all of you for coming. As you heard, I've been in the Chicagoanian exile for 46 years. And I had to look at a map because my memory of the map of Boston has gone fuzzy over the years. And I had to look at a map yesterday to see where I would be in relation to where I was born. And it's basically about 500 yards that way. It was also 79 years ago. So this area of the city has changed immensely since I was last here, let me tell you. Now, historians often stress the open-endedness of the stories they tell, the contingency of events that could have gone in multiple directions. Had the people taking part made different choices? In a sense, my talk today both conforms to this sort of narrative and departs from it. Without questioning the general principle of indeterminacy, I want to suggest that the key switches were thrown very early in the development of German corporate collaboration in the persecution and murder of the Jews, probably in the first 6 months of Nazi rule, surely in the first 18 months, and well before the regime's principal policymakers had decided what that collaboration would require. Barring a change in the erratic but inexorable momentum of Nazi government policy toward ever greater viciousness, these switches were irreversible. After putting up an only half-hearted and self-serving defense of some German Jews, while many others were losing positions and property during these initial months of Nazi rule, the leaders of the nation's largest corporations simply had no persuasive, let alone safe grounds to dissent later. As the Reich's policies radicalized, firms discerned ever-mounting reasons to take advantage of developments. In other words, the slippery slope started fast and proved steep. In view of the 2024 election results in the United States, it is a timely, worrying, and potentially instructive story. The slope tipped downward even before Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, since a fateful ambivalence regarding anti-Semitism already pervaded the upper reaches of Germany's largest corporations. On the one hand, unlike many fervent Nazis, few executives resented Jews as economic competitors or considered the commanding heights of the German economy verjudet, Jewified. The numerical presence of Jews on the managing and supervisory boards of the country's 90 most highly capitalized firms had dropped by almost 1/3 between 1907 and 1927. On the boards of the 300 largest non-financial firms in Germany, that presence fell by almost another third in only the ensuing 5 years. By 1932, almost 2/3 of these 300 leading firms had no Jews in senior positions. Multiple causes accounted for the downward trend. Mortality among senior industrialists with no suitable heirs or Jewish successors, mismanagement by some unsuitable progeny, mergers in the late 1920s that absorbed many Jewish-owned firms into publicly traded entities, resignations during the upheaval of the Depression, and government decrees that shrank the size of corporate boards and the number on which any individual could serve. Anti-Semitism appears to have played a role in one significant case, that of the disappearance of Jews from the managing board of the chemical giant IG Farben between 1925 and 1932, but not in others. After all, many of the remaining Jews were that by heritage only, and second or third generation converts to Christianity. Few were regarded as alien in any significant sense, and virtually none took political positions significantly different from those of their Gentile colleagues. Most contemporary or retrospective accounts suggest that anti-Semitism did not quite stop at the boardroom doors, but its grasp was relatively weak inside the threshold. Nonetheless, a particular mix of anti-Semitic aversions persisted among corporate leaders. It thrived not on animosity or rivalry toward Jews one knew, but on distaste for those perceived from a distance. Two such groups aroused particular ire. First, the roughly 100,000 traditionalist Jews from Eastern Europe, many of whom had immigrated during a period of lax border controls during and shortly after World War I. They now constituted 20% of the German Jewish population, appeared uninterested in integration, and aroused fears of incursion by the backward and unwashed East. Second, the numerous Jewish intellectuals who criticized capitalism from prominent positions in culture and journalism, and thus offended industrialists' self-esteem. The three examples here are Ernst Toller on the left, who was one of the most prominent German novelists of the 1920s, Max Reinhardt in the middle, who was the most famous theater director in Germany in the 1920s, and Theodor Wolff on the right, the editor of the center-left Berliner Tageblatt, which was not quite the New York Times of Germany in those days, but comparable in a sense. Uneasy with attacks on decent and accomplished Jews like themselves, but irritated by these other Jews, many corporate leaders gravitated toward a specious middle ground in policy, a fateful ambivalence typified by the diaries and papers of Fritz Rössler, the supervisory board chair at Degussa, a major inorganic chemicals firm in Frankfurt, whose successor nowadays is called Evonik. Rössler expressed opposition to infringements on the livelihood and legal status of long resident Jewish fellow citizens. But at the same time, he supported measures that would, as he put it, push back Jews' cultural influence, including by imposing quotas on their admission to universities and professional schools, what was known in Germany as the numerus clausus. Hitler, Goering, and other leading Nazis indulged this sort of distinction drawing prior to 1933 by echoing it or avoiding the subject of Jews altogether when meeting with big business leaders, even as Nazi newspapers and marauding stormtroopers threatened a much more sweeping assault. As a result, when Hitler came to power, most of the leaders of German big business underestimated the threat Nazi anti-Semitism posed to Jews, but already had ruled out a categorical defense of them. The faithful consequence of this weakness of anti-Semitism at the top of the corporate world became apparent swiftly during the spring of 1933, as the Nazi movement demonstrated its lack of deference to the nation's magnates and their scruples. At a gathering of some 24 high-ranking executives on February 20th in Berlin, to which Hermann Göring had attracted them with a promise that, quote, the Reich Chancellor will explain his policies, unquote, Hitler made clear that he was not interested in discussing economic issues, but rather in shaking down those assembled for monetary contributions to his current election campaign. The Nazis' method was to announce that they had no intention of relinquishing power regardless of the outcome of the voting, so the industrialist choice was between financing Hitler's win or experiencing civil war if he lost. He and Göring then departed, leaving Hjalmar Schacht, who is the man on the right in this picture, a former and future head of the German National Bank, to collect their monetary pledges, which ultimately amounted to 3 million marks. 2 weeks later, the Nazis manipulated the ground rules and won 44% of the vote, and their nationalist allies another 8%. Their qualified victory set off numerous wildcat actions by Nazi Party zealots in factories across the country, as non-Nazi workers' representatives were compelled to resign in favor of politically acceptable figures, and pressure mounted on companies to dismiss Jewish managers, reduce the numbers of Jewish employees, and replace them with unemployed Nazi Party members. This sort of agitation culminated in early April 1933, during and following the infamous party-organized boycott of Jewish shops and offices. Often overlooked is another event on that day, the appearance of Otto Wagner, the man on the left here, at the time the leader of the Nazi Party's Economic Policy Office, at the offices of the National Association of German Industry. He demanded the dismissal of 2 of the organization's business managers, their replacement by 2 government-approved appointees, and the removal of all Jews from its governing board. As it happened, the president of the association, the man in the middle there, whose full name was Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, that's about the most aristocratic German name you can imagine, was meeting at that very moment with Hitler. And when he learned that day of the demands, he entreated the Nazi Führer to rescind them. Hitler said no 2 days later, and Krupp caved in, over the protests of several other board members, whom he silenced by threatening to resign. This was the first fateful turning point as German big business capitulated to an entirely extra-legal demand, backed only by naked political power, and it occurred only 2 months after Hitler came into office. Thereafter, Krupp clung to what one historian has called a strategy of ingratiation. I prefer the word appeasement, hoping to maintain industry's influence over government economic policy by cooperating with the regime's political goals. Most of German big business fell in line behind this ultimately futile policy because they could not agree on an alternative, and because they liked other Nazi policies, such as the smashing of the trade unions. But both lack of conviction about defending Jews and fear of personal consequences contributed to the inertia. The mixed feelings that many executives harbored toward Jews meant that the most they could expect from the corporate world, at least in public, was the sort of temporizing defense that Carl Friedrich von Siemens, the man on the right here, who was the head of the electrical firm that bears his family name, the kind of defense that he offered in early April. He expressed, quote, "the sincerest sympathy to the German Jews who are deeply rooted in our fatherland, and the hope that this period of exaggerated anti-Semitism will soon belong to history," unquote. But then, Siemens also endorsed the arrest of what he called Edelbolschewisten, a term that means roughly cultured communists, including what he said was, quote, "a very large percentage of Jews, primarily newly immigrated ones," unquote. He then chided native-born German Jews for having failed to distance themselves sufficiently from the leftist politics of their, what he called, their racial comrades, unquote. And he endorsed the reduction of the share of Jews among lawyers and physicians, quote, "to a healthy proportion that approximates the population mix," unquote. In person, as late as May 1933, a few executives, notably Karl Bosch on the left of IG Farben and Hans Walz of the Robert Bosch Corporation on the right, tried to persuade Hitler and other leading Nazis that persecuting Jews would damage Germany, but to no avail. A behind-the-scenes effort from May to August to draft a memo for the economics ministry to the same effect, in which Karl Bosch, Krupp, and Siemens took part, resulted in a WAN document that endorsed the goal of, quote, bringing the views of the national government to fulfillment, unquote, but argued for proceeding slowly and avoiding economic disruption. The toothless text quickly became a dead letter. The second secret behind the general acceptance of Krupp's policy was the regime's intimidation of several highly visible corporate leaders during the spring of 1933. Paul Reusch, the man on the left here, was the head of a mining and machinery conglomerate and a dominant voice among German industrialists in the waning days of the Weimar Republic. He owned a newspaper in Munich that the Nazis wished to control. Between March and May 1933, Nazi officials dismissed the editors and appointed new ones, confiscated Reusch's stockholding, and arrested his protesting lawyers, making their release conditional upon acceptance of the expropriation. Reusch not only gave in, but henceforth lined up behind Krupp's course, which he had opposed initially. Simultaneously, two other figures here. Philipp Reimsma, in the middle, the head and part owner of Germany's largest cigarette producers, and Günther Quandt on the right, who had the same status in the leading producer of batteries, found themselves being investigated by the Prussian Justice Ministry for alleged instances of corruption and bribery during the Weimar Republic. Reimsma avoided arrest, but several of his leading managers did not, and he was subjected to attacks in the press and calls for his removal that came to an end only when he paid Hermann Göring a bribe of 3 million Reichsmark. Quandt's torture lasted longer and cost more. He and his chief subordinates were arrested. A Nazi commissar took over his plants for several months. He obtained release only by paying a bail that came, according to a headline in the New York Times, which shows you how much attention this attracted, to over $1 million US. He remained embroiled in expensive legal proceedings for another 2 years. Meanwhile, having gotten the intended message, both Reimsma and Quandt aligned themselves closely with the regime's policies, and Quandt became particularly active in driving Jews out of German economic positions. By the summer of 1933, the Nazi regime had shown Germany's corporate bigwigs who was horse and who was rider, as the German expression goes. The administration of this lesson involved passing threats to executives like Reusch, Reimsma, and Quandt, but lasting consequences for many Jewish firm owners, board members, managers, and even rank-and-file employees. They fell victim to a massive first purge that their Gentile colleagues saw as merely the price of a working relationship with the new regime. In the country's 300 leading industrial firms, 1/3 of the remaining Jewish managers and 1/4 of the supervisory directors, as of January 1933, lost their posts in the first half of that year alone. By mid-1934, the respective figures came to 57% and 50%. And for firms based in Berlin, almost 2/3 and more than 1/2. Changes of ownership were less extensive at this early stage, but still significant, especially in commercial fields on which the Nazis long had fixated: department and chain stores, newspaper and book publishing, state-owned industries and utilities, and suppliers to the military, government offices, and the National Railroad. Both with respect to directorships and ownerships, some major firms acted even before the regime applied pressure, exercising what the Germans call anticipatory obedience. The Deutsche Bank, the largest in the country, quickly dismissed 2 Jewish managing board members, even though Schacht told their colleagues this was not necessary. The Dresdner Bank hired Erich Niemann, one of Hermann Goering's former flying mates from World War I, to cajole the Jewish owners of firms tied to the bank to sell out before the firms lost value. In other words, from the beginning of Nazi rule, most leading German executives regarded the Nazi onslaught on the Jews strictly through the lens of personal and corporate self-interest. If individual managers or clients or suppliers were vital, firms tried to retain them, as so long as that was the case. If they were expendable, then one accepted what were called, quote, the requirements of the prevailing conditions, unquote, and extended at most help in finding jobs abroad, positive letters of recommendation, normal severance terms, and purchase prices that corresponded to the market value of what was acquired. But that value usually had been reduced, at first by the after effects of the Depression, and later by the increasing desperation of the sellers. Because the induced flight of Jewish property owners presented German big business with numerous opportunities to shelter rising profits, expand market shares, diversify, and vertically or horizontally integrate, the competition to cash in on Jews' misfortune picked up steadily. By 1937, niceties were falling away as regional Nazi economic advisors increasingly prompted the sales and influenced the prices. And banks and creditors shifted from fearing the loss of Jewish owners' expertise to fearing their loss of business and thus their ability to repay. Lenders thus tipped from being sustainers of Jewish enterprises to underminers of them. Meanwhile, firms began to take advantage of provisions that allowed them to reduce Jews' pension payments. The now defunct Dresdner Bank, which was then the second largest in the country, emerged as a pace setter in brokering property transfers and reneging on its commitments to Jewish former employees who numbered in the hundreds. The self-interest in persecution. I'm trying to keep track of the slides. The self-interest in persecution, which, for you younger people is easy, but for me this is tough. The self-interest in persecution operated particularly powerfully within the macroeconomic context that the Nazis created. Purging and dispossessing Jews wasn't just about gaining what they had, but also about pleasing the regime. In the second half of the 1930s, 2/3 of the annual growth of the German economy stemmed from state expenditures on armaments and import substitutes. The nation was a monopsony, an economy dominated by one buyer. We all know what a monopoly is, but I bet you've never heard the term monopsony before. A monopoly is an economy dominated by one seller. An economy dominated by one buyer is a monopsony. The buyer was the German state. And the German corporate world was dependent on and addicted to government contracts. Increasingly, a precondition for receiving those contracts was active cooperation in making Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. At the turn of 1937-38, the Nazi regime changed its policy from encouraging the removal of Jews from German economic life to enforcing it. The economics ministry issued a series of decrees withdrawing access to raw materials, foreign exchange, and government contracts from any firm with a single Jewish board member or senior manager, or in which Jews owned more than 25% of the stock. Since this meant the death of any firm that met those criteria, the decree set in motion a complete purge of the few Jews remaining in board positions and a massive sell-off of Jewish shareholding at increasingly party-dictated prices. The Nazi state conducted a census of Jews' assets in April 1938, and in the aftermath of the Kristallnacht pogrom of November began insisting upon the monetization of those assets, their consolidation in bank accounts to which the owners had limited access, and then the partial confiscation of those accounts. Corporations now became even more active and indispensable agents of persecution than previously. The major insurance firms paid the cash value of Jews' life insurance policies into those partially blocked accounts, while Edward Hilgard, the man here to the left, the head of Allianz, the largest of these insurance firms, persuaded Nazi leaders that his company did not need to pay some 50 million Reichsmark in Jews' fire and damage claims from the pogrom, what you see there on the right. Why? He said he made the factually outrageous but politically convenient claim that the Jews had provoked the rioting and therefore did not deserve to be paid. And he got away with it. The insurance companies end up paying $1.5 million in damages out of the 50 million that were caused. Degussa, this company, the inorganic chemical firm that I mentioned earlier, Degussa converted, the name Degussa is an acronym. It stands for Deutsche Gold- und Silberscheideanstalt. Altogether again, repeat. That means German Gold and Silver Separation Institute. It's a precious metals company. They smelt gold and silver. That's how they started. Degussa converted the precious metals bearing objects that Jews had to hand over to state pawn shops into bars of gold for the German National Bank and into bars of silver for industrial use. Meanwhile, the Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbanks, the three big banks of Germany, loaned much of the capital needed for corporate takeovers and took in fees for brokering them. And the same financial institutions collected, itemized, and administered Jews' assets, restricted Jews' access to them, and then transferred the sums exacted by the Nazi state to the finance ministry. The German government could not have done any of those things. The corporations were indispensable to them, this accomplishment on the part of the Nazi regime. Indicative of the degree to which corporate leaders and their firms had become constituent parts of the apparatus of persecution by early 1939 is the fact that of the activities I have just described, only Hilgard's was highly profitable. Even the brokering of property transfers turned out to be a low-margin business for banks because more assets were lost through the mass liquidation of firms than were gained on a small number of high-commission sales. But companies felt compelled to compete, not only for the assets the regime threw up for grabs, but also and sometimes primarily for political favor and the future preferences and rewards that it might bring. What the historian Neil Greger has called the normalization of barbarism among corporate policymakers became especially apparent regarding Jews' assets in the annexed regions of Austria and the Sudetenland and the subjugated protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia during the run-up to World War II. Once more, the now defunct Dresdner Bank was in the vanguard, gobbling up the lion's share of available financial subsidiaries and serving as the agent of corporations that belonged to the Nazi state, such as the Reichswerke Hermann Göring, or cultivated particularly close ties with it, including Mannesmann Steel. But now, even firms that had refrained from takeovers within the Reich, such as IG Farben and Schering, plunged in as a means of beating out competitors. The acquirers consistently regarded it as literally none of their business that the Nazi state then generally stripped the former owners of most of the sales proceeds, however meager. Given this record, by the time World War II began, corporations, like virtually all other German institutions, were virtually pre-programmed to participate in Nazi crimes. In fact, most of them already were so implicated in plunder and persecution that there was no turning back. Degussa had agreed to smelt the precious metals the Reich extorted from German Jews in 1939. How could it then refuse to do the same thing for the precious metals German bureaucrats squeezed from the Jews of Łódź in 1940, or even express reservations about purifying the metals that the SS later delivered to the National Bank from camps and shooting sites in occupied Poland and farther east? The Deutsche, Dresdner, and Commerzbanks had brokered and been party to numerous property transfers in Germany and served as transmission belts that collected, monetized, and steadily transferred Jews' wealth to the German state. On what basis would these institutions and their affiliates in occupied countries shun similar activities or cease to perform them once deportations began? Leading German manufacturers had pursued Jewish-owned enterprises in Austria, the Sudetenland, and the Czech provinces, especially prospective competitors and or former business partners. Why would these enterprises then refrain from tempting acquisitions in the expanding German sphere? Allianz had begun insuring SS-owned factories at Dachau, and Degussa's Degesch subsidiary had started supplying Sachsenhausen with Zyklon to fumigate clothing in 1940. Why should they withhold these services from new camps farther east later? With the power and wealth of Himmler's SS obviously on the rise in wartime, the benefits of good working relations with its leadership were too great to forego for firms or individual executives jockeying for advantage, and the risk of poor ties too great to assume. As a result, while first German rhetoric and then German actions turned toward annihilation as the final solution to the Jewish question, the extent of German corporate participation in the escalating criminality became largely a function of Nazi government policy. When and where that policy permitted or called for significant corporate involvement, the competitive ambitions of senior executives and their enterprises generally guaranteed its availability. When and where the regime saw reason to restrain these ambitions, the role of German big business in the Holocaust proved actually less than many large German firms wished. Contrary to popular perception, corporate takeovers of Jewish-owned property in occupied countries were one of the spheres in which the acquisitive ambitions of German firms were often disappointed. But when the SS asked, corporations treated it as a fitting business partner and became willing enablers of the Holocaust. The large commercial banks and their subsidiaries in occupied regions extended lines of credit to the SS and its offshoots and accepted massive deposits from them, which consisted almost entirely of sums extorted or plundered from Jews before or during their deportation. In Prague, the largest single depositor to the Dresdner Bank's affiliate was the SS Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which confiscated most of the assets of Czech Jewry. At the Deutsche Bank subsidiary, the largest depositor was the Jewish administration of the Theresienstadt transit ghetto, to which privileged Jews, you see, these are two images of Theresienstadt, to which privileged German Jews had to assign their assets before being allowed to spend a short time in this way station on the road to death. In Krakow, about half of the cash proceeds of Operation Reinhard, the pillaging and murder of Polish Jewry, landed in the vaults of another Dresdner Bank subsidiary. Along with the banks, Germany's leading precious metals processors and insurance firms actively sought out the SS's business. Determined to preserve its market leadership, Degussa unquestioningly accepted various forms of gold gathered by the SS, especially from the occupied East and the Netherlands, and refined it into some 5 metric tons of pure and fungible gold, some of which the big banks sold at a substantial profit on the open market in Istanbul. Allianz Insurance agreed to cover the shipments in both directions, from the SS to Degussa, and from it to the banks and then to Turkey. Instrumental in turning Jews' assets to the Nazi state's advantage, large German firms were also vital to the realization of the largest and most murderous death camp, namely Auschwitz. In fact, the place might never have acquired that dreadful status but for 2 related decisions on the part of I.G. Farben's leaders in early 1941. First, they decided to build a giant synthetic fuel and rubber factory 5 kilometers east of the camp at a place called Monowitz. This is what it looked like in 1944. And second, they decided to trade building materials destined for this project to the SS in return for gravel and laborers from the small concentration camp for Polish political prisoners that had been established the year before. The first decision created an appetite for labor that alerted Himmler to revenue-generating possibilities in the region. The more prisoners he had, the more money he would earn. The second decision allowed the SS to add an extra floor to nearly all the pre-existing barracks that constituted the fledgling concentration camp. That is, the steel beams that came from I.G. Farben and so forth allowed the elevation of all these barracks, which therefore permitted an increase in the number of inmates that were held there and that could be sold to the companies and revenue earned from them. When plans emerged later in 1941 to build a companion camp at Birkenau, and then early in 1942 to construct 4 large buildings containing gas chambers and crematoria there. This is one of those buildings. The construction firm selected was one in which the Dresdner Bank was the biggest shareholder and lender. AEG, a company founded and for a long time led by members of the Jewish Rathenau family, provided the electric circuitry. Once again, Allianz extended coverage for the workshops at the original camp and the Farben factory. The Deutsche Bank's nearby branch at Katowice loaned the SS 2 million Reichsmark, mostly for Birkenau, and an equal sum to Farben for its construction project. Having helped bring Auschwitz-Birkenau to life, I.G. Farben also aided the camp in producing death. The giant chemicals company was a part owner, albeit in a secondary capacity to its partner Degussa, in a company called Degesch. It controlled the production of Zyklon, a can of which you see there. That was a vaporizing pesticide that in 1941 became the principal murder weapon at the camp. No known evidence establishes that the representatives of Farben on the board of Degesch knew of the use of their product for gassing. But the business manager of Degesch, who worked out of the Degussa central office in Frankfurt, did know. And so did the principal owner of the firm that actually sold the Zyklon to the SS. And they both chose to continue delivering the substance and to not disclose the information. Farben's second connection to the death toll at Auschwitz was more demonstrable and direct. It involved supplying SS doctors at Auschwitz and other concentration camps with sulfa drugs and vaccines designed to combat dysentery, gonorrhea, tuberculosis, and typhus. These were then tested for efficacy and tolerability on inmates. In some of these experiments, half of the prisoners treated as guinea pigs died, but the total number of victims is unknown. Still, a third way in which Farben contributed to the mortality rate at Auschwitz was the firm's exploitation of thousands of inmate slave laborers at its nearby factory and coal mines. The best estimates of the death toll vary between 13,000 and 28,000 prior to the evacuation of the site in January 1945. By that time, the practice of putting camp prisoners to work in German industry had become widespread. At the end of 1944, it included more than 700,000 people spread among enterprises deemed vital to the German war effort. Farben's deal with Auschwitz for labor in early 1941 actually blazed a trail in this regard. Until then, only the construction firm Philipp Holzmann had made extensive use of ghetto or camp inmates, whom it put to work on building a highway from Berlin to Łódź in 1940. But Farben's agreement with the SS still conformed, at that time, to the general SS preference for locating factories near camps, not camps near factories. Volkswagen broke this taboo later in 1941 by arguing successfully for establishing a camp at its factory in Wolfsburg for inmates to work building a smelter to make aluminum. These arrangements remained unusual until late 1943, when Albert Speer, the armaments minister, and Heinrich Himmler of the SS concluded that the Reich's labor shortage was so acute that Jewish camp inmates had to be put to work in multiple German factories, along with numerous non-Jews that were being rounded up across occupied Europe. Most industrial leaders gratefully accepted the workers thus offered, concluding that they were indispensable to maintaining or increasing output, given the massive military call-ups of industrial workers and the already high rate of German female employment. The tunnel vision that pervaded industrial participation in the Holocaust especially characterized the readiness of German industry to exploit inmate labor during World War II. It amounted to a willingness to walk over corpses, as the German equivalent of the phrase "to stop at nothing" goes. For the employment of inmate labor occurred on terms that contained perverse incentives. The SS charged a fee per inmate per day that in many cases exceeded what a German civilian laborer, especially a construction worker, would have been paid. Even when this was not the case, the relatively low productivity of inexperienced inmates offset any savings on pay. As a result, employers sought to economize on food and housing, to drive prisoners excessively hard, and to work them long hours, at least as long as replacements were available for those who fell by the wayside. In other words, the use of so-called slave laborers became a process in which firms and their leaders reduced camp inmates to the status of a factor of production that could be used up like so many pieces of coal. Of the 1.1 million camp inmates put to work between 1941 and 1945, about half for government projects like building the bunkers along the Atlantic coast and underground factories like those that made the V-2 rockets, and about half for firms that produced arms and vital materials. Of this 1.1 million, 500 to 600,000 perished. Participation in this crazed process, including in the massive effort in 1944-45 to bury factories underground in order to save equipment and production lines from bombing, was fostered by executives' real fears of ouster, arrest, and execution. In 1942 alone, Paul Reusch, remember him, was forced out of the leadership at his conglomerate as was Ernst Pönsken at the head of United Steel, the biggest private company in the country, while the regime also succeeded in removing or disempowering all the top executives of the nation's 5 leading aircraft firms, BMW, Heinkel, Messerschmitt, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf. In 1943, 2 directors of Deutsche Bank branches, Hermann Köhler in Stuttgart and Georg Mieter in Silesia, there's a picture on the left of Georg Mieter, were denounced to the Gestapo by people who overheard them making disparaging remarks about Nazism and or its leaders. Not only were they both condemned to death that fall, but the Nazi national newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, published an article that made a public example of Mieter. Around the same time, Wilhelm Ricken, the head of the Rhenish-Westphalian electricity works, was charged with, quote, undermining the fighting spirit, unquote, of the nation for having predicted Germany's impending defeat to colleagues. Executed in May 1944, his death is recorded today on a Stolperstein, that is a stumbling stone, on a sidewalk in front of his last residence in the city of Essen. Finally, in the late stages of the war, the regime repeatedly scapegoated corporate leaders for breakdowns in output or air defenses by alleging sabotage. Rudolf Blom, the man on the far right there, the head of his family's shipbuilding firm, Erich Zipprich, the chief engineer of BMW, and 2 leaders of submarine factories, all faced such charges. Throughout the descent of German corporate conduct from the abandonment of Jewish colleagues in 1933, through profiting off Jews' dispossession and murder, to working Jews to death, the leading executives embodied the thoughtlessness, the indifference to the people on the receiving end of their deeds that Hannah Arendt defined as the banality of evil. Indeed, they embodied it far more accurately than the sort of man to which she applied the term, Adolf Eichmann, who both disregarded and relished the effects of his actions on others because he profoundly believed in what he was doing. At the center of corporate complicity was my mundane and myopic dedication to short-term self-interest, whether defined as monetary returns, personal advancement, or individual or corporate survival. As Raoul Hilberg, one of the pioneers of Holocaust studies, observed, in most German organizations throughout the Holocaust, quote, normal procedures were employed as if extreme decisions were not being made, unquote. The main impetus behind this ethical numbness was a relentless focus on oneself and one's own blinkered priorities. So what's the point of this long story? Refusing to defend people as a group can lead to persecuting them as such. Once the haters acquire power and the capacity to mold human self-interest, including firm self-interests, to their purposes. And once this process gathers momentum, it is far harder to stop than to accept, far harder to reject the justifications than to begin to echo them. The results were catastrophic, especially for Jews, but also for Germans themselves, but not for most of the big business figures who collaborated with Nazism. True, some of these executives were caught up in the Nuremberg military tribunal proceedings against the leading directors of Flick, Krupp, and IG Farben, Karl Rasche of the Dresdner Bank, and Paul Pleiger of the Reichswerke Hermann Göring. This is the rogues gallery of these people. Friedrich Flick was one of the foremost takeover artists of Jewish property in the Third Reich. Krupp, we've already talked about. The IG Farben directors are there. Karl Rasche is the man who was most responsible within the Dresdner Bank for its crimes. And then there was there was also a French trial of a man named Hermann Röchling, who is This is Paul Plager at the top. Hermann Röchling is there at the bottom. He was a steel industrialist. But both the prosecution and the defense badly distorted the historical record. On the one hand, the prosecutors at Nuremberg emphasized claims of a conspiracy between business and the Nazi regime that never really happened, and ignored the opportunism and self-protection that did. On the other hand, the defenses stressed compulsion as an excuse, even though it was far less important than the industrialists' swift acquiescence and adaptation to the Nazi regime's purposes and continuous desire to profit from them. Though convictions outnumbered acquittals, the sentences were generally mild at these trials. Only the verdict in the Krupp case got to the heart of corporations' liability, and all of the condemned executives were released by 1951, making the longest time served 6 years. Moreover, most companies that had participated in persecution emerged richer in 1949 than they had been in 1933. And most of the executives responsible prospered during the 1950s and 60s. For the next 4 to 5 decades, German industry engaged in a remarkably successful PR campaign, at least within the country, to load responsibility for the crimes of Nazi Germany, especially its exploitative policies in occupied Europe and toward forced and slave labor, onto Nazi fanatics and the German state they controlled, and thus to avoid paying any financial compensation. Meanwhile, corporations hoarded remarkably extensive archives while blocking research into what actually had happened. Both these dams against reparations and research broke in the aftermath of German unification in 1990, resulting in payments of almost 5 billion euros to the relatively few still surviving forced and slave laborers, and to a flood of publications, which that is a bookshelf in my office on the right-hand side, which consists solely of publications about German corporations in the Nazi era. I have 2 of those. I read those books, so you don't have to. And it resulted in the flood of publications that made this lecture possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Hayes, for that wonderful and, in some ways, timely lecture. Now, the floor is open for questions and comments. And just one note, the microphone doesn't amplify. It's for the live stream, so just speak into it and don't worry about it not being loud. One more point is if you could introduce yourself, too, that would be great.
My name is Taylor. I'm a student here. My question is, so you said at the very beginning that the corporations, before Hitler came into power and before the Nazis actually won the election, that they gave corporations a sort of like a ultimatum that whether you either fund us or you'll face consequences after we win.
That's right after Hitler came in.
Oh, right. Okay. So I just wanted to know whether you believe that whether the Nazis actually had the physical power to give consequences to all the corporations, or whether it was sort of posturing so that they could get enough corporations on their side to build enough power to get the rest. And
more the latter than the former. They didn't yet have the power. Am I getting picked up? Okay. All right. They didn't yet have the power to do that. What they were threatening the corporations with was disorder. You're not going to make any money if the nation is broken up in a civil war, and we're not going to leave office. So that was the shakedown. That was the pressure point. But then they also were saying to these corporate executives, we're going to use the power in ways that you will in some ways like. We're going to smash the trade unions. Now, I don't want to take it too deeply into the weeds of this, but in the 1920s, under the Weimar Republic, the democratic system set up a system of national arbitration of wages. So if you worked at a steel factory anywhere in the country, your wage packet was set by the decision of this national arbitrator. So you didn't have to strike at your local factory. It was all done on a national level. The corporate world hated this. And one of the reasons why they wanted the Republic to change, at least, was they wanted to get rid of this. Well, the Nazis said, sure, we'll get rid of that, because we're going to dictate what the wage level is going to be. And we're going to dictate that in terms of what is the most advantageous for us to get maximum output. So we'll work with you on that, and you don't have to deal with the labor union people at whom you look down anyway, right? So there's a combination of carrot and stick here. And if there's a bottom line, the Nazis created a carrot and stick economy, which they used for business and against business, depending on what they wanted at a given moment. And what they mostly wanted was maximum output of armaments and products that would substitute for imports, because if you are going to go to war to conquer the territory that Germany needs, you don't want to be subjected to somebody blocking the Strait of Hormuz. And if you're not importing oil, but you're making gasoline out of German coal, and this is, and you know, the big import substitutes were synthetic fibers. Germany had three major imports: gasoline, rubber, wool and cotton. And what the Nazi regime wanted to do was make substitutes for all of those things out of what we have. And Germany doesn't have much: coal, water, wood, earth, and air. That's it. And so the chemical industry produced substitutes for these things out of wood. Most synthetic fibers start out from cellulose. And they make gasoline and rubber from coal. So and they make money in the 30s, nothing like the money they were used to making in the 20s, but it's still a steady return, and the government is a reliable customer. So,
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sunny Diamond. I'm a first year. I'm in Professor McGowan's class. During your speech, I was kind of having a full circle moment, because after our history class today, I remembered my 8th grade Jewish history project, and 3 out of 8 of my great-grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And my Zadie, who survived 6 concentration camps, he actually made V-2 rockets in one of them. So hearing your speech was incredibly powerful, knowing that my family is within the statistic that survived. So truly thank you for your speech. I'm still comprehending what you're sharing. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Jack. For some of the companies, did any of them flat out refuse to help or comply with the Nazi regime? And if they did they have to, were they, the owners of the company or the board, were they executed, or were they just merged within?
no, nobody's executed except there are 2 people. The British execute 2 people. They execute the manager of the company that sold the gas to the SS and his chief assistant. So because a secretary in the company overheard them talking about what had happened. So clearly they knew what the substance was being used for. The British execute those 2. Nobody else is executed.
Jack's asking about if Germans, if there were any of those who resisted, if Germans.
I'll get to that.
Oh, sorry.
Evaded. There are companies that evaded. And so you take an example, you won't remember, but there was a picture back fairly early in the talk about a man named Hans Walz. He worked for Robert Bosch, the people who make spark plugs and electric and so forth. Bosch, the man after whom that company is named, was a liberal. He belonged in the 1920s to the League Against Anti-Semitism in Germany. He kept his distance from the Nazi regime. When the issue of slave labor came up, forced labor, he managed to assure that the main factories that belonged to Robert Bosch never took any of them. But the subsidiaries that made military equipment did. So you see, that was his little margin for maneuver. There was another company up on the north shore of Germany called the Trägerwerke, and they made gas masks. And initially, and Träger was another one of these characters who's ambiguous. He was a kind of right-wing political figure before the Nazis come in, but he doesn't want concentration camp inmates in his factory. And he finally is forced to accept them because Goebbels proclaimed that there was going to be everybody in the country was going to get a gas mask. So the production had to go up very high. And his principal competitor, the Auerwerke, agreed to take the laborers. So then that was used as leverage against him, and he ended up taking them. So there's almost no exception. There are these, people get around things. Similarly, I remember I said in there that IG Farben and Schering's also a pharmaceutical company, they still exist. They did not pounce on Jewish-owned property within Germany. But the minute they move into Austria and the Sudetenland and there are all these things up for grabs, then they go in. So there's different timelines, but that's about it.
Hi, sorry. My name's Clay. I'm in Professor McGowan's class. I was just wondering, because you had mentioned the company that had produced the gas and the companies, like the bank companies, if there was a particular company that was the most influential or the most absorbed in using the Holocaust.
Oh, a lot of competition. I think the worst offenders that you would know are IG Farben, because of the not only the Auschwitz and the medical experiments were done. IG Farben doesn't exist anymore. It's BASF, Bayer, and then a third company was called Hoechst, which has now been absorbed in a French company. They were deeply implicated in all that. And then the other one that has escaped accountability is Siemens. Siemens is an internationally famous company. Unlike many of these companies, that bookcase, that's many of the big companies in Germany now have hired historians to write their history. They've opened up the archives. Those books result from that. Siemens is the biggest company in Germany that has refused to do that. And there is an official history of Siemens published in the States by the Ohio State University Press in about 2005, but it was written by a professor who actually worked for the company. So that's the pattern. The companies that were the slowest to do this, not surprisingly, are family-owned firms, because we're talking about grandpa, and they don't want grandpa's dirty linen to be washed in public. But even they are now coming around. There's a book about to come out in English about Henkel. Henkel is the producer. Henkel can be spelled many ways in German, and Henkel without a C is a company that is the biggest detergent producer in the world. Henkel with a C makes knives. Yeah, and but the Henkel family, which is the detergent producer, headquartered in Düsseldorf, I tried to get into that archive several times. And they were very closely related to Degussa, a company about which I wrote a book. And so the archivist at Degussa asked them to let me in, and they wouldn't do it. And now they're finally having a history come out about. So slowly but surely.
I have the microphone.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's an incredible honor to have you here sharing with us your original findings. I have a question that might sound a bit academic. My understanding is that there was some nationalization of industry during this period. So to what extent would you describe the Third Reich's political economy as state capitalist? And if there was nationalization, well, how much nationalization was there, and how was that determination made about which industries or sectors?
It was always possible. The thing about, remember, some of you are too young, but when I was growing up, in the afternoon there were these movies that would come on TV, and they would always be these films made in the 30s and 40s, and it was this image that, the Gestapo man comes in, says, we have a car, there's a motor running outside, yeah, all of that. So there's this sort of sense in Nazi Germany that the police state was everywhere. It wasn't, but it could be. It was not what they were constantly doing, it was what they could do if they wanted to. So any one, like the example of Mita, whose head is cut off, and they publicize that in the national newspaper. That's all you need, you know? That's an example. This could happen. So there were cases of nationalization. Junkers aircraft in 1934 was nationalized. The Hermann Göring Werke is a creation that the state brings into life because the existing producers of steel don't want to use domestic iron ore within the country, which is low grade. They want to keep importing high grade iron ore from Sweden, but you've got to pay for that. And the Nazis don't want to be subjected to imports from another country. So the Nazis want to use the low-grade iron ore. The companies say, that's not economical for us. And the regime says, well, we'll make it economical for you. We'll give the fields to a company that will fund from state money, and it will compete with you now. And that threat was, so this was always possible. They also created a company called Brabag, which did some of the processing of coal into gasoline. So they created a competitor for that. They created 5 state-owned synthetic fiber companies. And then they required all the clothing in Germany to have an admixture of synthetic thread. So you create both the supplier and the demand. So now state capitalism, there have been a lot of these terms that have been thrown around, and people can pick holes in every single one of them. The term I use is carrot and stick economy and monopsony. You know, this is not quite socialism, but there's nothing restricting the state if it wants to interfere. Private property continued. You can still make a return, all of that. But the terms on which you will earn the return are dictated from the top, from the center, from the state. So I kind of have chickened out on the terminology because these arguments, you know, you got to be, I didn't say this to you before, but I'll say it now. One of the problems with the word genocide is that once you create a legal definition and then something happens, you fight about whether the something that happened fits the definition, which distracts you from the something that happened. And the term genocide applies to certain forms of action of mass killing, but not to other forms. And thus we end up, you know, and how do you qualify for having crossed the line? So we always have to be careful about when we create these rubrics, because they embrace things, but they exclude things. And some of the things they exclude can be just as bad as what they embrace. So, you know, what I did, basically, it's a regime in which the state controls the terms of production. Individuals can continue to profit from that. So it's not state possession of property, but the state makes the rules.
I have the mic now. I'm Lori Lefkowitz. I think people know me here. I direct our Jewish Studies program. First, also thank you for something that was a talk that was so clear and information rich. It was a stunning achievement. I want to return us to where you started. I found the talk terrifying and sobering, and you talked about contingency, almost as if there was a road not taken, and a road was taken and momentum built up. So it was a story of an absence of a moral compass, of greed and failures of courage, and failures of powers that be to get together to resist. It was competition created individual units with self-interest, and then history happened. I also, like the first student who spoke, want to say my father was a slave laborer. So this is very personal for me. We are living in a moment, you alluded to that, but we're not talking about it, of anticipatory compliance, of universities, law firms failing to get together and making agreements to resist demands that are illegal, et cetera. And I don't know if you want to speak about the present, but if you would just even speak about the past in your own imagination, what might have been the alternative path to take? What could be the alternative paths to take?
Clearly, there was a collective action problem, that these groups that are attacked, they don't pull together and respond in a way that where they protect each other. We saw it in America when the law firms, shattered, when Trump put pressure on them, and some of them caved and some of them didn't. Now, the ones that didn't, we have something in this country that they didn't have in 1933. We have a district court system which is independent. Where in Nazi Germany, the courts, there wasn't anything comparable to being able to sue the government. And the judges considered themselves basically part of the Ministry of Justice. There were, in some of the labor courts, you see in early 1933, Jews are being fired, and they sue. They go to the labor courts and they say, I've got a contract, you can't do that. And for a while, judges rule in their favor, but it doesn't last long.
Why?
Because the Ministry of Justice says, we'll fire you. The judges can be removed. It's not an independent judiciary the way it is here. And so that legal structure that has created some space here did not apply in Germany in early 1933. So, what would have been better? What would have been better is if people had said, look, what's at stake here is our collective interest as citizens. These people all took refuge in the interests of the firm. So as defined by the bottom line, or whether you can get contracts and investment and so forth. But interests are not things. They aren't things. They're definitions. People state them, and you have all different kinds of interests in any walk of. I have interests in the professoriate. I have interests in the university, but I have interests in the citizenry, people's human rights, things like that. What do you assign priority to? For most of these people, it was reflexive to assign priority to the firm or the family fortune or whatever. And that's not so surprising, but you have to have a different sense of values to go along with that if you are going to stand up against these pressures. Now, we've been really lucky. This book came out about a year ago, and when it came out, I was profoundly pessimistic about the way things were going. My own university caved. We were all appalled. We paid a $75 million ransom to the federal government in order to keep the grants flowing. But we are a lot better place now than we were then, because some people have stood up. Minneapolis. You know what Minneapolis made me think of? Middlesex County in 1774. When people started, stockpiling flintlocks and saying, this is tyranny and we're going to do something about it, and then the British march out and they get met at Lexington and Concord. Well, ICE sort of got met in Minneapolis. And that was not from the top down, that was from the bottom up. That was just people. Now, what these people should have done in 1933 is they should have seen the menace. And of course, there were a lot of, but I tried to prepare you for why by saying there's all this ambivalence about Jews. And therefore, they won't defend Jews as a group. They will defend only the Jews they like, or like them. And they delude themselves. They really think, they're not going to go after our friends. They're going to go after those people. And so, now we have a lot more experience because we've got this story that they didn't have. And that is helpful right now, because this whole story is a warning. I think we're not nearly in as dangerous a position as we were 12 months ago. We're not out of the woods, but because there's been more stiffening of the backbone, more people willing to put their fate on the line. You've been very patient. You've got the mic, too. Look at that.
Martin, I'm also a student here. And well, first and foremost, thank you for the presentation. It's super insightful and amazingly explained and made. And then to my question, I was going to ask, I know you explained how once the momentum got going, it's hard to stop, right? I mean, the agencies became agents of persecution, and the Nazi regime had a very strong grasp on it later on. But at the beginning, in the 1930s, when Jewish board members were getting ousted from those positions, what were the initial motivations? Was it purely anti-Semitism, or were there things behind it, like dispossessing them of what they owned, just trying to change the structure of political power within it, or was it just purely based on the anti-Semitism at the time?
This is a tough one because, anti-Semitism is a superstition. But how do you explain superstitions? And how do you explain why people believe in superstitions? Do you read your horoscope?
Sometimes.
Yeah, I didn't mean to force you to answer that. But there's absolutely no reason to believe that what's published in the Herald or the Globe as a horoscope, which will say something for September 7th, my birthday, entirely different from what the Chicago Tribune will say. There's no reason to believe this stuff. But, people believe in superstitions. And how do you explain them? Now, I can tell you how the Nazis elaborately justified their hatred of this people and their fear of this people. Okay, the racism had an underpinning. That is, they said, look, all nations compete, but the competition between Britain and France, or France and Germany, we can all understand that. That's people who have their own country and they're fighting over territory or whatever. The Jews don't have a territory. Remember, this is before the founding of the State of Israel. So the Jews live everywhere. And say the Nazis now, the only way they can prosper is by sucking out things from the people among whom they live. And their interest in keeping those people weak is that then no other nation is dominant over them. Now, this is all nonsense, but repeated over and over again, and then tricked out with, we lost the First World War because the Jews undermined the war effort, also absolute nonsense. But you repeat these stories, you lie, you create an image of mistrust, and then you say, everything wrong in this country is not your fault, it's their fault. And thus you get rid of them, everything will be fixed, right? So there's a flattery built into this, there's a fear, there's a simple explanation. So anyway, that's what they did. And very few German business people who were much more sophisticated than this bought into this. But they did buy into the sort of, well, they're not exactly like us. They're anti-cap. Many of them write for the newspapers and so on. We can all get behind this or we can get behind the polarization, because many people, the cliches in America used to be, he's never met a payroll. That was a way of dismissing somebody who has not been in the business world. And then the people who write for newspapers and so forth are the chattering classes. And so the people who work in commerce tend to look down on those people and say they're unrealistic and I don't have to listen to them. And then you pair that with they belong to a particular group, and you can mobilize all of that. So the attack on people in 1933 is basically building on all of these accumulated notions, synthesizing them into one coherent package as to why they are the problem. Get rid of them, we fix everything, and you get to feel good about yourself again.
So this is where we I have the tension between my desire for this incredible conversation to keep going and the reality of needing to let you go home. So I am going to give the final question to another Professor Emeritus, Laura Leff.
Hi. I understand what you just said, except for in the case of 1933, these people were firing board members, right? So they knew them. This was not
Like-
the objective other. They were
Right.
firing managers at their banks.
Yep.
And so how does, I mean, it wasn't quite that distant. And then sort of a related question was, did they treat what they called non-Aryans differently than full Jews? I mean, was there sort of a sense of those people might be more like us, so we'll keep them on?
They are allowed to be more generous to those people because the regime's persecution of the varying degrees of so-called Mischlinge is less, and it evolves with a delay. And so many of these companies have half Jews on their staffs up to 1943. Remember also the German business elite. There had been a great deal of intermarriage in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. So many of the people who are in these positions, Degussa had a very important scientist named Berwind, whose mother was Jewish. And he kept working throughout the whole thing, but he always was fearful. And he was also, they were related to the founding family of the company, so that kind of protected him. But so there are these stories like that. Now, they do take that jump in 1933 about, it's not going to be about our friends, but when it becomes about our friends, I guess we'll bite the bullet. They take it remarkably easy, And then sometimes the tragedy of this, you read about some of these, I'll tell you a story about a man named Charles Rosenthal. Charles Rosenthal was a Jew. He was the head of Philip Holtzmann, which was the biggest construction firm in the country at that time. He was not only that, he was like, in 1933, he was 29 years old. I mean, to shoot to the top of a German corporation at the age of 29 in that era was unheard of. When the Nazis came in, they went to Philip Holtzmann, the namesake of the company, the son of the founder, and said, you have to fire Rosenthal. If you don't fire Rosenthal, we will not let you bid on street repair contracts or any of those things that we have to do with. And Holtzmann goes to Rosenthal and says, what do I do? And Rosenthal says, I'll quit. There's a number of these stories where the tragedy is the Jewish victim, because they volunteer. They say, look, it's important what we do and what we built here and so on and so forth. And they send Rosenthal to Bolivia, a construction project in Bolivia, and he is there for about 4 years. And then the German expat communities in all these countries have Nazi Party affiliates. And the Nazi Party affiliates in Bogota drive him out and say he has to go. And he goes to New York, he comes to New York in 1939 and he dies. And it's this tragedy but he thought the decent thing for him to do was to say, I'll take one for the team. And there are multiple stories like that. So.
Well, it is a shame not to end on a more optimistic note, but these are the days we live in.
I am such a downer.
Thank you. No, thank you so much, Professor Hayes, for this incredibly edifying talk. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I hope to see you Friday at 1:45 in the same location. And how many talks you go to that have a door prize? Brian Bell and Jedediah Saul, you each get a copy of Professor Hayes' book. Thank you so much, Peter. That was really
Glad to do it.
wonderful. Really
Glad to do it.